Hi, I'm Glenda Cedarleaf, and this is the classic story, Snow White. So I invite you to become comfortable in the ways you know best as we now begin this tale. Once upon a time in midwinter, when the snowflakes were falling like feathers from heaven, a beautiful queen sat sewing at her window, which had a frame of black ebony wood. As she sewed, she looked up at the snow and pricked her finger with her needle. 3 drops of blood fell into the snow. The red on the white looked so beautiful that she thought, if only I had a child as white as snow, as red as blood, and as black as this frame. Soon afterward, she had a little daughter that was as white as snow, as red as blood, and as black as ebony wood, and therefore they called her Little Snow White. Now the queen was the most beautiful woman in all the land, and very proud of her beauty. She had a mirror which she stood in front of every morning and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" And the mirror always said, "You, my queen, are fairest of all." And then she knew for certain that no one in the world was more beautiful than she. Now Snow White grew up, and when she was 7 years old, she was so beautiful that she surpassed even the queen herself. Now when the queen asked her mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" the mirror said, "You, my queen, are fair, it is true, but little Snow White is still 1,000 times fairer than you." When the queen heard the mirror say this, she became pale with envy, and from that hour on she hated Snow White. Whenever she looked at her, she thought that Snow White was to blame that she was no longer the most beautiful woman in the world. This turned her heart around. Her jealousy gave her no peace. Snow White was now all alone in the great forest. She was terribly afraid and began to run. She ran over sharp stones and through thorns the entire day. Finally, as the sun was about to set, she came to a little house. The house belonged to 7 dwarfs. They were working in a mine and not at home. Snow White went inside and found everything to be small but neat and orderly. There was a little table with 7 little plates, 7 little spoons, 7 little knives and forks, 7 little mugs. And against the wall, there were 7 little beds, all freshly made. Snow White was hungry and thirsty, so she ate a few vegetables and a little bread from each little plate. And from each little glass she drank a drop of wine. Because she was so tired, she wanted to lie down and go to sleep. She tried each of the 7 little beds, one after the other, but none felt right until she came to the 7th one, and she lay down on it and fell asleep. When night came, the 7 dwarfs returned home from the work. They lit their 7 little candles and saw that someone had been in their house. The first one said, "Who has been sitting in my chair?" The second one, "Who has been eating from my plate?" The third one, "Who has been eating my bread?" The fourth one, "Who has been eating my vegetables?" The fifth one, "Who has been sticking with my fork?" The sixth one, "Who has been cutting with my knife?" The seventh one, "Who has been drinking from my mug?" Then the first one said, "Who stepped on my bed?" And the second one, "And someone is lying in my bed." And so forth until the seventh one. And when he looked at his bed, he found Snow White lying there, fast asleep. The 7 dwarfs all came running, and they cried out with amazement. They fetched their 7 candles and looked at Snow White. Good heaven, they cried. She is so beautiful." They liked her very much. They did not wake her up, but let her lie there in their bed. When Snow White woke up, they asked her who she was and how she found her way to their house. She told them how she had run the entire day, finally coming to their house. The dwarfs pitied her and said, "If you will keep house for us and cook, sew, make beds, wash and knit, and keep everything clean and orderly, then you can stay here, and you'll have everything that you want. We come home in the evening, and supper must be ready by then, but we spend the days digging for gold in the mine. You will be alone then. Watch out for the queen, and do not let anyone in." The queen thought that she was again the most beautiful woman in the land, and the next morning she stepped before the mirror and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in the land is fairest of all?" The mirror answered once again, "You, my queen, are fair, it is true, but little Snow White, beyond the 7 mountains, is 1,000 times fairer than you." At last, she thought of something to do. She disguised herself as an old peddler woman and colored her face so that no one would recognize her, and went to the dwarf's house. Knocking on the door, she called out, open up, I'm the old peddler woman with good wares for sale." Snow White peered out the window. "What do you have?" "Bodice lace, dear child," said the old woman, and held one up. It was braided from yellow, red, and blue silk. "Would you like this one?" "Oh, yes," said Snow White, thinking, "I can let the old woman come in. She means well." She unbolted the door and bargained for the bodice laces. "You are not laced up properly," said the old woman. "Come here, I'll do it better." Snow White stood before her, and she took hold of the laces and pulled them so tight that Snow White could not breathe, and she fell down as if she were dead. Then the old woman was satisfied and went away. Nightfall soon came, and the 7 dwarfs returned home. They were horrified to find their dear Snow White lying on the ground as if she were dead. They lifted her up and saw that she was laced up too tightly. They cut the bodice laces in 2, and then she could breathe, and she came back to life. "It must have been the queen who tried to kill you," they said. "Take care and do not let anyone in again." Meanwhile, the queen asked her mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" The mirror answered once again, "You, my queen, are fair, it is true, but little Snow White and the 7 dwarfs is 1,000 times fairer than you." She was so horrified that the blood all ran to her heart, because she knew that Snow White had come back to life. Then, for an entire day and night, she planned how she might catch her. She made a poisoned comb disguised herself differently, and went out again. She knocked on the door, but Snow White called out, "I'm not allowed to let anyone in." Then she pulled out the comb, and when Snow White saw how it glistened and noted that the woman was a complete stranger, she opened the door and bought the comb from her. "Come, let me comb your hair," said the peddler woman. She had barely stuck the comb into Snow White's hair before the girl fell down and was dead. "That'll keep you lying there," said the queen, and she went home with a light heart. The dwarves came home just in time. They saw what had happened and pulled the poisoned comb from her hair. Snow White opened her eyes and came back to life. She promised the dwarfs not to let anyone in again. And the queen stepped before her mirror. "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" The mirror answered, "You, my queen, are fair, it is true, but little Snow White with the 7 dwarfs is 1,000 times fairer than you." When the queen heard this, she shook and trembled with anger. "Snow White will die, if it costs me my life." Then she went into her most secret room. No one else was allowed inside, and she made a poisoned apple. From the outside it was red and beautiful, and anyone who saw it would want it. Then she disguised herself as a peasant woman, went to the dwarf's house, and knocked on the door. Snow White peeped out and said, "I'm not allowed to let anyone in." The dwarfs had forbidden it most severely. "If you don't want to, I can't force you," said the peasant woman. "I am selling these apples, and I will give you one to taste." "No, I cannot accept anything. The dwarfs don't want me to." "If you are afraid, then I will cut the apple in 2 and eat half of it. Here, you eat the half with the most beautiful red cheek." Now the apple had been so artfully made that only the red half was poisoned. When Snow White saw that the peasant woman was eating part of the apple, her desire for it grew stronger. So she finally let the woman hand her the other half through the window. She bit into it, but she barely had the bite in her mouth when she fell to the ground, dead. The queen was happy, went home, and asked her mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" And it answered, "You, my queen, are fairest of all." "Now I'll have some peace," she said, "because once again I'm the most beautiful woman in the land." Snow White will remain dead this time. That evening, the dwarfs returned home from the mines. Snow White was lying on the floor, and she was dead. They could not bring her back to life. They laid her on a bier, and all 7 sat next to her and cried for 3 days. They were going to bury her, but they saw that she remained fresh. She did not look at all like a dead person, and she still had beautiful red cheeks. They had a glass coffin made for her and laid her inside so that she could be seen easily. They wrote her name and her ancestry on it in gold letters, and one of them always stayed at home and kept watch over her. Snow White lay there in the coffin a very long time, and she did not decay. She was still as white as snow and as red as blood, and if she had been able to open her eyes, they still would have been as black as ebony wood. She lay there as if she were asleep. One day, a young prince came to the dwarf's house and wanted shelter for the night. When he came into the parlor and saw Snow White lying there in a glass coffin, illuminated so beautifully by 7 little candles, he could not get enough of her beauty. He read the golden inscription and saw that she was the daughter of a king. He asked the dwarfs to sell him the coffin with the dead Snow White, but they would not do this for any amount of gold. Then he asked them to give her to him, for he could not live without being able to see her, and he would keep her and honor her as his most cherished thing on earth. Then the dwarfs took pity on him and gave him the coffin. The prince had it carried to his castle and had it placed in a room where he sat by the whole day, never taking his eyes from it. Whenever he had to go out and was unable to see Snow White, he became sad, and he could not eat a bite unless the coffin was standing next to him. Now the servants who always had to carry the coffin to and fro became angry about this. One time, one of them opened the coffin, lifted Snow White upright, and said, "We are plagued the whole day long just because of such a dead girl." And he hit her in the back with his hand. Then the terrible piece of apple that she had bitten off came out of her throat, and Snow White came back to life. She walked up to the prince, who was beside himself with joy to see his beloved Snow White alive. They sat down together at the table and ate with joy. Their wedding was set for the next day, and Snow White's godless mother was invited as well. That morning she stepped before the mirror and said, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in the land is fairest of all?" The mirror answered, "You, my queen, are fair, it is true, but the young queen is 1,000 times fairer than you." She was horrified to hear this, and so overtaken with fear that she could not say anything. Still, her jealousy drove her to go to the wedding and see the young queen. When she arrived, she saw that it was Snow White. The queen turned even greener with envy and red with rage. She was consumed by her self-centered attachment to superficial qualities, an attachment that blinded her from even caring about her own daughter. In the depths of this blindness and bitterness, she became so inflamed and in minutes fell to the floor, never to wake up again. Snow White was relieved that with the death of her mother, she would never be hurt by her again. And with time, the sadness and anger over being abused and betrayed by her own mother began to subside. Snow White was now able to fully receive the love that was bestowed upon her by the prince. She never forgot about how the prince loved her so deeply that he stayed by her side, even when it seemed she would never come back to life. How he always held out hope for her return. Snow White was also deeply grateful for the love and loyalty shown to her by the 7 dwarfs. And in recognition of their kindness, she honored them by choosing a different dwarf each day of the week to celebrate and honor. She remembered to say prayers of gratitude for these beings who had saved her over and over from harm. Snow White now knew that it was her naivete, her lack of discernment, and her inability to discern the truth of her situation that caused her to fall for her mother's trickery. In time, she became very wise, and in that wisdom, she was able to give and receive love and relationships of honesty and trust. And all the days of her life, Snow White and the prince lived with great love and happiness. And that's the end of the story.